At 7:51 on a chilly Monday morning, a dust-choked box truck rumbled into the narrow lane off Bull Street, its tires crunching over damp cobblestones, then shuddered to a halt in front of a quiet restoration shop where the scent of aged turpentine and aged oak mingled in the autumn air. And the man inside did not yet know he was about to be handed 5 paintings that had already been declared dead by people who did not understand what they were looking at. The driver stayed in his cab long enough to finish a phone call, exhaling cigarette smoke into the cold morning light, then stepped down with the bored confidence of someone delivering trash, because that was exactly how the paperwork had been written. And the first insult of the day was already waiting on the truck bed, wrapped in yellowed moving blankets that smelled of neglect. Daniel Marsh had been up since 5:30, making oatmeal for his daughter Claire with measured hands, cutting orange paper into something close enough to red for her science fair board, and packing her lunch with a folded paper crane, because some wounds are too deep to name, and some things a father fixes without ever telling the child how close he came to failing. When the driver knocked on the bay door with the hollow echo of a man who had delivered bad news before and said, "Mrs. Aldrin says sign and initial," Daniel did not argue, because men like him do not waste breath on people who have already decided what they think of him. And Daniel had learned long ago that silence is the last dignity left to a man who refuses to beg. He unfolded the slip, read 5-line items marked condition code red, estimated value 0, and saw the name Victoria Aldrin printed where a signature should have warned him that someone powerful had mistaken his shop for a dumping ground, and that the ground beneath him was already shifting. He signed anyway, not because he agreed, but because he understood that the first move in any fight is usually made by the person who wants to look generous while handing you something rotten. And Daniel had spent years watching men like the driver mistake authority for wisdom. Then the driver began unloading, his boots thudding against the truck bed like the slow tolling of a funeral bell. One by one, the paintings came down on dollies wrapped in old moving blankets, heavy with stale dust, softened glue, cracked varnish, and the kind of neglect that can make a masterpiece look like debris to people who only measure worth by shine. And Daniel saw beneath the grime, beneath the fractures, beneath the lies the artists had told to survive their own eras. The first canvas was a landscape with fractured varnish and a long stress line across the lower left corner, damaged enough to scare off a careless buyer, but not damaged enough to fool a man who had spent his life listening to what objects were trying to survive. And Daniel heard the silent plea beneath the cracks. The second was a woman in a yellow dress standing by a window, her warmth buried under decades of oxidation, but Daniel still saw the light under the grime, and that was the first sign that these were not dead works at all, but sleeping giants waiting to be awakened. The third was larger, heavier, and older in a way that made the studio feel colder the instant he pulled the blanket away, its edges curling like the pages of a forgotten book. It showed a black family at a dining table with afternoon light cutting through shutters, and the webbed cracking across its center told him at a glance that somebody had stored it rolled, which meant somebody had never been told to respect what they did not understand. And Daniel felt the weight of generations pressed into the fibers. Daniel lowered his penlight, and his hand tightened around it just enough for the cap to creak, the beam slicing through the dust like a scalpel through silence. Not because the painting was ruined, because of the signature hidden in the lower right corner, a small interlocked C&A like a whisper from the past. He knew that mark. He had seen it years ago, in rooms where people wore watches worth more than his rent, and still did not know how to value the man cleaning the frames in the corner. He stood among 5 paintings that had been dismissed in less than a minute and understood, with the cold certainty of a man recognizing a buried voice, that one of them had once belonged to the Aldrin family line, and that the past was not dead, only sleeping. He also understood something else. Whoever sent them here did not realize what they had just handed over. A Pandora's box of history wrapped in bureaucratic indifference. Daniel reached to the shelf above his workbench and lifted a small glass vial of cadmium yellow paint, his own hand-mixed formula, and held it to the morning light as if checking whether the color was still alive and whether he still was. It was a small gesture, almost nothing. But it was the kind of motion a man makes when he senses a story has entered the room and decided not to leave quietly. And Daniel had spent a lifetime listening to stories that refused to stay buried. He set the vial down carefully, looked once more at the paintings, and understood that the clock had already started. And that time was the one thing even restorers could not fix. The woman who had signed the order would come back. She would come back with a different face than the one she had used to send the truck. And by the time she did, everything she thought she knew about value, ownership, and the man in the paint-stained apron would already be changing, and Daniel would be ready. The next morning, a charcoal Range Rover rolled up to the shop, its engine purring like a sleek predator, and the woman behind the wheel stepped out alone, dressed like someone who had never waited for a door to be held open in her life. Victoria Aldrin wore a graphite blouse that shimmered like polished steel, a tailored blazer that whispered of boardroom battles won without a single bullet fired, and the kind of blonde hair that catches light without asking for it. And she carried herself with the confidence of a CEO who had learned to make rooms move around her. She did not knock. She opened the bay door with the ease of someone accustomed to doors opening before she arrived, and walked straight to Daniel's bench, as if the space had already been arranged for her arrival. And Daniel felt the air thicken with unspoken questions. She set a single page in front of him and said, with a voice as flat as polished stone, that her legal team needed a supplementary release and that the same terms applied, because Victoria Aldrin had spent years giving orders, not receiving them. Daniel read the page in silence, his eyes tracing the legalese like a restorer tracing the ghost of a brushstroke. Victoria watched him with the patience of someone used to other people doing the reading for her, and her eyes moved over the shop as though she were measuring it against a standard he had never asked to meet. And Daniel knew she was seeing a rustic workshop, not a museum of invisible work. The solvent bottles were lined by type, the irons were hung by size, and the vacuum table sat centered like a machine built to heal damage with discipline. And Victoria wondered how something so orderly could feel so foreign. On the wall behind him hung a framed photograph of a man in a larger studio, standing beside an older gentleman with one hand on his shoulder. And Victoria glanced at it, then looked away without comment, because rich people are often very good at pretending not to notice the exact thing that might matter later. Daniel signed the release without raising his head. He did not negotiate. He did not ask why. He simply placed the page back on the bench and returned the pen as if the whole exchange had been a formality he had already endured in his mind before she arrived. And Victoria felt the first crack in her armor. That should have been the end of it. But on her way out, Victoria heard his voice behind her, soft but deliberate, cutting through the hum of the workshop like a scalpel through silk. "Are you certain you want to keep painting number 3? She stopped walking, her heels freezing against the concrete floor, as if the question had been a physical force. The room did not change, but her body did, because the words had touched something she had not expected anyone in that shop to know. And Victoria realized she had just been handed a key to a door she hadn't even known existed. She turned slowly and asked what he meant, her voice steady but her pulse betraying her. He did not explain. He only said that he wanted to make sure she had made a considered decision, and that was all. But it was enough to make her feel, for one sharp second, that the floor beneath her had shifted by half an inch. And Victoria Aldrin hated feeling unstable. She had not told anyone which painting was which. The manifest had used lot numbers only. She had never looked at the canvases herself. The inventory review had been handled by Garrett Voss, her COO, the man who had started speaking for her in boardrooms before she had learned which questions he wanted her to hear. And Victoria now wondered how many other decisions she had not made herself. So how did the restorer know there was a painting number 3? Victoria drove away with that question lodged in her chest like a splinter, and she told herself it meant nothing. But that is what people say when the first clue has already entered the bloodstream, and Victoria Aldrin was not a woman who ignored the whispers of her own body. In the afternoon, she sat in a corner booth at the old Pink House with 2 board members, the chandeliers casting diamonds of light across the table. And when one of them casually referred to the Charleston clean-out as dead weight, she smiled as if the word did not land inside her like a slap. And Victoria felt the old lie settle over her like a shroud. Franklin Carr leaned closer and said Voss had handled the disposition himself very thoroughly, and that some small Savannah restorer had taken the lot off her hands. And Victoria laughed too, because that is what executives do when they are still pretending the room has not turned into a trap. Then she went back to her hotel and requested the full archive from the Aldrin family records, and the answer did not come quickly. It came in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror reflecting back at her, and Victoria realized she had been seeing only what Garrett wanted her to see. The physical provenance files had been moved out of legal storage 18 months earlier. The transfer was listed under a category she had never seen before. The category had been introduced through the office of Garrett Voss, and Victoria's fingers tightened around her pen. That should have been the point where she felt alarm. Instead, she felt something colder, a quiet dread creeping up her spine like the first chill of winter. She opened her father's personal archive, the one she had been given access to after his death. and found the Southern Collection folder, its leather spine cracked with age, its contents whispering of a history she had never known existed. 5 paintings. Each one catalogued, cross-referenced, and appraised years before her company ever touched them, and Victoria felt the weight of 5 lives pressing into her hands. The total value on the 2018 document was $4.2 million, and Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The pages were organized with the precision of a man who believed order could keep memory from being stolen, and Daniel Marsh's name appeared in the margins like a ghost. Near the back of the file, her father's handwriting appeared in blue ink on a small sticky note. Do not transfer or dispose of without written authorization of the original lead conservator. Victoria read that line 3 times, her vision blurring with a shock of recognition. Then she opened the covenant, one page, her father's signature, and a second signature. Daniel E. Marsh, lead conservator. She leaned back in the hotel chair and stared at the ceiling fan while the room went very still around her. And Victoria Aldrin understood, for the first time, that she had been standing on the edge of a precipice without even knowing it. The man in the apron had not simply guessed. He had known, and he had let her walk into his shop and sign her own ignorance onto paper. And Victoria felt the burn of shame rise in her throat. That realization should have made her angry. Instead, it made her uneasy in a way she could not name, a feeling like standing on a cliff in a dream, knowing the fall would hurt but unable to step back. She went back to the shop that evening and found the paintings unwrapped, each one lit on its own easel, each one looking less like damage and more like a conversation interrupted too long ago. And Daniel stood at the third painting, the one with the family at the table, and did not turn until he heard her footsteps stop. She told him her father knew him. He said he knew that, and Victoria felt the first crack in the wall she had built around her grief. She told him he had restored the paintings in 2019, and before that in 2017, and once again years earlier, and he answered as if he were talking about weather, not the hidden history of her inheritance, and Daniel's calm only deepened her unease. Then she asked about the covenant. He said yes. She asked why he had not used it the moment the truck left. He looked at her as if the answer should have been obvious to anyone with a living heart, and Victoria felt the room tilt beneath her. He said her father trusted him with the paintings, not with a lawsuit. He said the covenant was there to keep something irreplaceable from being thrown away by people making fast decisions in hard years. And Victoria heard the echo of her father's voice in Daniel's words. She understood the sentence only halfway at first. Then it hit her fully. He had not been protecting himself. He had been protecting the work. That made the room feel different. It made him different. And Victoria Aldrin began to suspect that the man she had dismissed as a rustic restorer was sitting on top of a much larger truth than she had expected. The back office door opened, and Claire appeared with the focused look of a child who knows adults are discussing something too large for the room. And Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it, then admitted that yes, she had called the shop rustic. Claire nodded once and said, in a tone so direct it made the whole studio quiet, that her father had told her about that, and he had said it like it was interesting, not cruel. Then Claire added that she wanted to know whether Victoria still thought it. Victoria looked around the shop, at the tools, the journals, the restoration table, the order, the discipline, the care, and she said she had been wrong about what she was looking at. Claire accepted that answer with the grave certainty of a child who has decided whether a person belongs in the room, and Victoria felt the weight of judgment lift from her shoulders. That tiny exchange changed the temperature in the space more than any corporate apology ever could, and Victoria realized she had just been given a lesson in humility by a child. Victoria stayed longer than she intended. She came back again 2 days later, and the day after that. By the third visit, Claire was reading on her stool while Victoria worked on her laptop in the corner, and the room had begun to arrange itself around the possibility that this strange, polished woman might eventually become part of the rhythm. And Daniel watched from the shadows, knowing that trust is not built in boardrooms but in quiet moments. But the real shift came when Victoria brought her own archive notes and spread them beside Daniel's restoration records, and she asked him to explain the third painting. He did. He explained the painter, the family, the exhibition history, the missing records, the years of neglect, and the reason a lost work can keep its dignity even when its frame has spent years in the wrong storage room. And Victoria listened without interrupting, because interruption is a habit of power, and for once she did not want to be powerful. That was new for her. So was the realization that she had spent years treating art like value while Daniel treated it like memory. And Victoria felt the old world crumble beneath her. Her father had done the same. Her grandfather had done the same before him, And Victoria understood now that the Aldrin legacy was not in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the hands of men like Daniel Marsh. The shop on Bull Street was not rustic. It was a museum of invisible work, and Daniel was its curator. And the man standing in the middle of it was not a handyman waiting for permission. He was the person who had kept the family's actual history from being erased, and Victoria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Then he told her something that made her breath stop for a second. Her father had planned to bring her to Savannah before he died. He had wanted her to see the studio and the paintings in person. He had wanted her to understand the collection before she inherited responsibility for it. And Victoria turned toward the window, unable to speak, as the rain began to tap against the cobblestones like a metronome, counting out her father's final days. Daniel gave her the space to feel it, and Victoria realized that grief is not a wound that heals, but a river that carries you forward whether you want to go or not. Later, when she finally asked what the covenant gave him, he explained the precise rights, the consultative role, and the future restoration terms, all with the same economy he used when talking about paint layers. And Victoria felt the weight of $5 million settle on her shoulders. Then he mentioned a codicil. He had not planned to bring it up. He only did because she asked, and Daniel opened the cabinet, took out a sealed envelope, and handed it to her. Inside was the second reveal, not a weapon, not a threat, but a promise. Her father had signed a notarized codicil appointing Daniel as Heritage Conservation Trustee with 10% equity in future commercial proceeds from the collection, contingent on full restoration. And Victoria read it twice, then a third time, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. Daniel had known about it for 5 years and never used it, and that fact hit harder than any accusation. He had been sitting on equity while accepting $4,000 in disposal fees and signing release forms she now realized were built to keep him quiet. And Victoria accused herself of being a fool because she had never asked the right questions. He told her she had been lied to, which was different, and that distinction changed her face because for the first time she saw the difference between deception and omission. It changed the story she had been telling herself since her father died, and Victoria understood that some lies are not told with words, but with silence. The next time Claire entered the room, she carried a small glass vial of cadmium yellow paint that she had mixed herself, and the color was almost right. Daniel looked at it, adjusted his expression, and told her the oil was a little warm, and Claire nodded and went back to try again. Because children who grow up around real craft learn early that correction is not humiliation when it comes from someone who wants the work to survive. Later that evening, Victoria asked Daniel to come to Charlotte. Not to fight, not to surrender, but to sit in the boardroom and help her understand what her father had intended and what had been buried under Garrett Voss's version of the company. And Daniel told her he needed 2 more weeks to stabilize the third painting. Then he would come, and Victoria knew that time was running out for everyone involved. In Charlotte, Garrett Voss was building a parallel plan. He had already decided that if the restored paintings became legible in the market, he would attack Daniel through a non-compete clause and label the whole thing unauthorized use of corporate assets. And he sent his own memo to the board and prepared the file as if he were setting a trap that would close on schedule. He had no idea the ground under him had already begun to collapse, and Victoria felt the first flicker of hope since her father's death. 2 weeks later, Daniel walked into the Aldrin boardroom in a clean flannel shirt, his boots clicking against the polished floor like a metronome counting down to war, and he sat at the far end of the table like a man who did not need to pretend the room belonged to him. Victoria opened the meeting without preamble and named him as lead conservator and heritage trustee under the covenant her father had signed, and Garrett tried to dismiss it as an operational issue. Victoria answered with a kind of calm that ends careers. She told the board the Southern Collection had been appraised at $4.2 million in 2018. She told them the covenant had been misfiled in a category introduced through Voss's office. She told them the disposal contracts contained a clause he had inserted into 7 separate transactions over 3 years, and Victoria watched as the room began to realize it was standing on quicksand. She told them an outside forensic firm had traced shell entities in Delaware to the beneficial owner of several of the transfers, and the air in the room turned to ice. And then she watched the room stop breathing. Voss shifted once in his chair, the only sign he gave, but Daniel saw it, because men who have spent years around machines know how to read tiny changes before the system fails. Victoria told Voss that security would escort him out while the board continued without him, and the sentence landed so quietly that everyone heard it twice. Voss stood, tried to hold the room with his eyes, and failed, and he was escorted out in silence, his empire crumbling 1 step at a time. Then Victoria presented the codicil, and the room changed again. One board member, an older woman who had known the family for decades, looked at Daniel and said her father had chosen well, and Daniel nodded, because sometimes the right answer is simply to listen. Another asked why he had not used the document sooner, and Daniel answered that the work mattered more than leverage. That answer stayed in the room longer than the man who gave it, and Victoria felt the old world die and a new one take its place. The board voted unanimously to restore him as chief powertrain engineer and formally recognize his advisory role. And the $2.4 million withheld from his severance years earlier was authorized for immediate payment with interest. Voss's assets were frozen by the end of the week, and Victoria felt the first breath of justice she had known since her father's death. The press release went out on Friday, and for the first time in years, the company began to look like it had been steered back toward the reason it had existed in the first place. 6 months later, the Southern Collection opened at the museum in Savannah, and the 5 paintings hung under conservation lighting, restored so carefully that the damage no longer shouted louder than the art. The third painting, the one Victoria had almost thrown away, now carried its history like a recovered scar, and Claire stood in front of it with a notebook in her hand and asked Daniel to tell the story again. He did, not because the story had changed, but because she had. And Daniel realized that stories are not told to preserve the past, but to shape the future. That is what children do when they are raised near real work. They learn to ask for the history behind the object, not just the finish on the surface. Victoria stood nearby in a dark blazer, her blonde hair down, looking less like a woman in command of a company and more like someone who had finally begun to understand what responsibility actually costs. And she carried the cadmium yellow vial in her jacket pocket, its weight a reminder of all that had shifted. It had become a small private symbol of everything that had shifted. Not perfection, not power, but precision, care, and the willingness to adjust when the color was wrong. At the end of the evening, when the gallery emptied and the lighting dimmed, Daniel stood alone in front of the third painting, while the room behind him softened into silence. And the last visitors had gone, the caterers were packing up, and the city outside was turning blue. Victoria walked up beside him and said her father had once stood in front of paintings like this and gone quiet in a way she had never understood until now, and she said he had been listening. Daniel did not answer right away. Then he told her that her father had planned to explain everything to her himself, but time had reached him first, and Victoria said she knew that now. She also said she had signed a paper once that nearly turned $6 million of history into trash. And Daniel looked at her and said the paintings had brought her here, but they had not been the reason she stayed. She did not ask him to explain. She already understood. And Claire called from the other room that she was hungry, and the sound of her voice made the evening feel ordinary again in the best possible way. Daniel smiled, said he was coming, and looked at Victoria one more time before walking toward his daughter. And she lingered beside the painting for a moment, then slipped the vial of cadmium yellow back into her pocket and followed them out. Some things are built to last. Some things are worth restoring. And sometimes the people who look like they are delivering the trash are the only ones in the room who can tell the difference. And Daniel Marsh had spent a lifetime proving that truth.